Hey there, and thank you for joining us here at the Gathering Online. My name is Maddie. I am the online pastor here. I am so excited you decided to worship with us today. If you're new to our channel or you haven't done it yet, be sure to go and click the subscribe button before you click away. Sermons like this one drop every Sunday and are available on demand all week long. We also have other videos that roll out that are part of our in-person worship experience, and they're another way that you can learn more stories about the Gathering and stay connected. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss anything. You can also go to the description of this video to find a link to our website to learn a little more about us, a link to a Connect card, which allows me to know that you're here and gives me the chance to reach out and say hello, and a link to give if that's something you're interested in doing today. Again, all of that can be found in the description of this video, and you can also make sure you subscribe before you go. I hope you enjoy this message. Have a good time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Gathering. Thank you so much for being here in worship. Now, just this last week, a person in our church who had been reading along through the book of Job, they said to me, Matt, I got to the end, and I got to tell you, God is a lot like a politician. And I sort of laughed, and I said, well, what do you mean? And the person said back to me, he never really answers the question. Today, we are ending our sermon series, Why Bad Things Happen. And we've been studying the book of Job. I've said every week, Job is the story of a guy who does everything right, and yet he has so much go wrong. And so the whole book is about the kinds of questions that we ask when things go wrong in our own life. We see Job constantly ask these questions of God, questions that come up anytime we're experiencing suffering or distress or disappointment in our lives. And today we get to the very end of the book. And last week I said that the book ends with Job and God finally sort of facing off. And last week we read Job's side of that conversation, where Job challenges God, accuses God. We saw that Job was hurt. He was angry. He was disappointed. He was emotional. He wanted answers, and he thought God had some explaining to do. And today, as we end the book and really the whole series, God finally speaks back to Job, providing some answers. But the person in the congregation isn't entirely wrong. God does provide answers, but a little bit like a politician, God doesn't actually answer the question that Job is asking. You see, from the very beginning, Job's whole mindset was why. Underneath every one of the questions he asked was this question of, God, why are these bad things happening to me? But when God finally speaks back to Job, he answers a different kind of question. God doesn't answer the question why, he answers the question what. Instead of why do bad things happen, we get an answer to what does God do about bad things. And God's answer to Job really spans like 4 chapters, and I really encourage you to go read it. I can't read the whole thing here, but let me give you just sort of the AI version of what happens, the Cliff's Notes. When God begins to answer Job, it begins in this way. He says, "Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. Who is this darkening counsel with words lacking knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man. I'll interrogate you and you'll respond to me." And then in what follows, God gives this sort of sweeping account of the creation of the world, the entire cosmos, all along the way reminding Job that he wasn't there when the world was created, but God was. It says in verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you know. Who set its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring tape on it? Have you gone to the sea's sources, walked in the chamber of the deep? Have death's gates been revealed to you? Can you see the gates of deep darkness? Have you surveyed earth's expanses? Tell me if you know everything about it." And this goes on and on and on. And what we begin to see is here, God is sort of challenging Job. God is essentially saying, I know, Job, that you have real questions, but just remember that you weren't there when I created the world. You don't see everything I see. You don't understand everything that I understand. You don't perceive everything that I perceive. In some ways, God is telling Job, if you think you could have made the world a better way, go ahead and tell me, how would you have done it? But of course, Job can't. He in the end recognizes that he doesn't know. His knowledge is limited. His perspective is restricted. And he finally admits that. When we get to chapter 42, Job responds to God this way. He says, I know you can do anything, God, and no plan of yours can be opposed successfully. I have indeed spoken about things I didn't understand. And in the end, Job sort of relents. He cries uncle. He stops his questions and he realizes that perhaps God does know better what God's doing. And what we see in the end is Job decides to trust in that. Now, a lot of people get to the end of the book of Job and they conclude, well, I guess the whole point is it's just a mystery. God knows, but we don't know. God understands, but we can't understand. And they sort of move on. And that's partly true. Certainly, part of the book of Job is him realizing that God has a perspective, a scope, and understanding that we as human beings just don't have. And that includes in moments of suffering. But that's not really the whole message of the book of Job. In fact, I don't even think it's the main message. If you leave it there, that everything's a mystery, you kind of miss out on what I think is the most powerful part of the book, and really the part that gives us the most hope. Because while it's true that God never really answers the question, why do bad things happen? God does offer that answer to a different question. What does God do about bad things? And so that's what I want to end with today. When God responds to Job, he doesn't explain why suffering is going on, but God does explain, here's what I do in the midst of your suffering. So what is it that God offers Job? What is it that God does in the midst of our suffering? Well, the first thing God says is God limits suffering. Okay, when you look around at the world, and I know this is easy to do now, especially with news and social media and everything else, it is really easy to begin to believe that just everything is kind of going to hell. I mean, you watch the news and there's wars and there's poverty and there's natural disasters. You look closer to home and there's just so many things that are happening to people. There's cancer and diagnosis and there's disappointment and job loss and hardship and addiction and anxiety. I mean, all these things are going on. It's so easy to look around and just see the bad, just see the suffering. And it can just sort of seem like chaos is taking over. At least it certainly looked that way to Job. But God reminds Job in his answer that suffering is real, but it's limited. Bad things cannot take over life because God actually limits what suffering is able to do in this world. Listen to what he says. He says, who enclosed the sea behind doors? When it burst forth from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment, the dense clouds its wrap, when I imposed my limits for it, put a bar on doors and said, you may come this far, but no farther. Here your proud waves stop. Now, let me just say something really quickly. Some of you may know this, but in the Bible, the sea or the waters, the ocean, that's a symbol. It's an ancient symbol for sort of the chaos and unpredictability and suffering of the world. And just like you look at the ocean, it looks vast, it can't be controlled, it looks chaotic. So a lot of people look at the world and say, there's so much suffering, there's so much bad. It just seems vast, it seems uncontrollable. And yet here, God shows Job that the chaos and the suffering of the world is limited, it's contained. When he says, who holds the seas back, puts a bar on the door, says you can go this far, but no farther. Here, what God is reminding Job of is he's reminding Job that chaos and suffering are a part of the creation, yes, but they're not all of it. In fact, chaos is always surrounded by good things. Or a different way of saying this is suffering is never your whole story. Yes, suffering is part of your story, but suffering is never your whole story. Last week, I told the story about my friend Dan. Dan, who he lost one of his sons in a car accident at age 22. And Dan and his wife, Jen, are actually in my core group. And just this past week, we were sort of talking about that. He was processing some of it. And we came around to this idea that even in the midst of terrible tragedy, terrible suffering, there are still these moments of gratitude and beauty. And Dan shared that even now, Even though his world in so many ways is crushed, there's still these moments of joy, these moments of surprise. He's grateful for the gift of his wife and the joy that comes from spending time with his other son. Even in the midst of suffering, suffering is never the whole story. And the same is true for all of us. I think sometimes when we're going through bad things, we can begin to think that everything in our life is bad. Bad things have this way of kind of forcing us into a sort of tunnel vision that make us think like nothing's going right. And yet, even in the middle of really bad things, there are always good things that are relentlessly present. When we grieve, we still find these little moments that make us laugh. When we have an awful day at work, there's still someone maybe there for us when we get home. When we're going through a terrible breakup or we just lost a job or when something in life isn't working out, there's still the beauty and the joy of good friends who come and surround us. When something doesn't work out, we oftentimes will begin to notice all the things that actually are working for us. Suffering is real, but it's never your whole story. God is providing for you. God is caring for you. God is giving you reason for joy, even in the midst of those really difficult seasons. And so the first thing that God reminds Job of is, yes, suffering might be real, but it is limited. God limits suffering. The second thing we learn from God's response is that God is present in suffering. Several different times the story tells us this. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. I think it's really interesting that every time God speaks in the book of Job, it says that God speaks from the whirlwind. Why would the story say that? Well, the whirlwind is another symbol. It's another symbol for the chaos and the evil that seems to exist in the world. And when the story says that God answered from it, I mean, literally, the story is reminding us that God is not outside the chaos. He's not above it or below it. God is right in the middle of it. When Job finds himself in this season of suffering where everything in his life feels like a whirlwind, God is right there with him. And this is so important because one of the things that Job is constantly lamenting throughout the book is this feeling that he's all alone, that he's been somehow abandoned by God. Friend, this is a frequent theme actually throughout Scripture. And it's a danger, I think, for any of us who ever go through hardship or times of suffering, is that suffering makes us feel like we're all alone. It isolates us. It makes us feel like we've been abandoned by God and by people who love us. I mean, even Jesus on the cross felt this way when he said, my God, why have you abandoned me or forsaken me?" When we're in pain, we are most vulnerable to believing that we are isolated and alone. And suffering has a way of making all of us feel that way. In fact, I've really begun to believe that the evil one, if you believe in that, and I do, the evil one wants us to feel this way. Suffering has this way of whispering these lies to us. Things like, no one wants to hear your problems, or nobody's going to understand, or nobody cares. People are too busy, or you don't want to share that with other people, or what would they think of you? And you better just keep it in. Suffering has a way of tempting us to just stay isolated. Suffering wants to isolate you. But when God speaks from the whirlwind, God sort of shatters the lie that we're alone there. God reminds us, God isn't above us or below us, but God is with us. Years ago, in the early days of the gathering, we had a young woman who was tragically killed, and I went to go visit her husband, and when I was there, a friend of mine, someone that I've actually known for a long time, I said, what can I do? Is there anything you need? He said, you want to just sit down and you want to just eat. And so I sat down, and for like an hour, it felt like 3 hours, we just sat there eating Arby's and watching football. He didn't say a thing, and I didn't say a thing either. Now, sometime after that, he was talking to me and he said, I don't remember very much about that day. I certainly don't remember the things that people said to me, but I remember you sitting down eating Arby's with me and watching football. Friends, I know a lot of you can relate to that. I mean, it wasn't my words, it wasn't explanations, it wasn't answers. It was just my presence that made a difference for him. And I know that you can relate to that. When you're hurting, do you really want somebody to come along and say, "Well, I have the answer. I know exactly why this is happening"? Do you really want simple answers or sort of cheap cliches? Probably not. Even though we ask the question why, we don't really want somebody to answer that. What we really want is to know we're not alone. What we usually want is somebody just to be present with us. What we really want is folks to show up. 99% of caring for people is just showing up. You don't need, a pastoral care degree to eat Arby's and watch football. It's about presence. Job might be asking the question of why, but God knows that whatever answer, even if it's from God, isn't going to help. But instead, God reminds Job that he's present with him. And the same is true for you, friends. God reminds you that wherever you are right now, he is there. We are never left alone in the middle of that whirlwind. So God limits suffering. There's always good things there with it. God is present with us in suffering. And then the last thing that God reminds us of in this answer is that God will defeat suffering. If you get to the end of the book of Job, and I encourage you to do that, it sounds almost too good to be true. After Job accepts God's answer, after their conversation is over, it tells us almost simplistically, and then the Lord changed Job's fortune when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord doubled all Job's earlier possessions. And it goes on to say Job got his crops back and his land back and his, animals back and more kids than he ever had before. They were more beautiful than anything else. And it's like the Bible's version of "and Job lived happily ever after." And I know we're tempted to get to this part of the story and just say, really? That's how it ends? We kind of laugh at this. But I don't think the book of Job is trying to be like a fairy tale. I really don't. In fact, this ending that seems too good to be true is actually trying to tell us something. It's actually pointing to the promise that God makes, not just for Job, but for all of us. Most importantly, I think what it's saying is that suffering is real, but it is not permanent. I mean, yes, Job tells us that in sort of a fairy tale way, but God makes this promise that suffering is real, but it is not permanent. God, in other words, has defeated suffering, the Bible tells us, and there's going to be a day when it is no more. I mean, that is, after all, where Jesus comes into the story. Jesus wasn't just a good guy who lived and taught, but the power of Jesus is that he died and he was resurrected. And he said, because I've defeated death, you will defeat death also. Suffering might be real, but it is not permanent in our lives. And that's the reality that awaits us. In fact, if you go all the way to the end of the Bible, this is the picture that the Bible leaves us with. This is Revelations 21, and I want you to hear these words. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the former heaven and the former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. There will be no more mourning, crying, or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." Then the one seated on the throne said, "Look, I am making all things new." By the way, did you notice that the sea, that image of chaos, it says in Revelations, the sea will be no more. No more chaos, no more suffering, no more pain. That's not a fairy tale. That is what God promises us in Jesus. One of my favorite images of heaven, and I often talk about it every funeral I preach, one of my favorite images of heaven is that great banquet table that Jesus described, where we'll all get to feast again. Except around that table, when we will be reunited with those that we love, when we sit around that table, This time we'll sit there without poverty and without cancer and without anxiety and without addiction and without hardship, without struggle, without self-doubt, without shame or grief or death or anything else. We will sit there as our whole selves, and we will be with those that we love the most. It's a beautiful picture, I think. And it's not a fairy tale. God says, this is what I promise. This is the end of your story. And it gives so many Christians great hope, especially when we're going through trying times here. It's a reminder that suffering is real, but it is not permanent. Friends, it's always dangerous to sum up a book as beautiful and complicated as Job. But if I had to sum it up, I would say something like this: life is chaotic. Life includes incredible beauty, but also deep pain. Life includes these moments of joy, but also has the capacity for great disappointment. And we will regularly ask why. Why is the world the way that it is? And some of you may even wish that God gave you more of an answer, but I don't think we'd be satisfied with any answer that God gave us. Some of us even stop believing in God because of the evil of the world, but not believing in God doesn't fix the evil of the world. It just leaves us alone in it. But instead of answering that question of why, God answers the question of what. God reminds us what he is doing about bad things. And God reminds us that he limits suffering, that he's present with us in suffering, and that he is working to defeat suffering in the end. And I think all of this provides us what we actually need the most during times of hardship, and that is hope. What we need in our suffering is not answers, but hope. Friends, today, I don't know where you are in your own life, but I know that some of you right now are in the midst of a tough time. Maybe it seems small relative to some of the stories I told, but it doesn't matter whether you just feel stuck in a rut. Maybe you're looking for something new, or you've recently lost something that you love. Maybe you're in the grief of losing somebody. Maybe you're in the fear of receiving a diagnosis, and maybe you've lost your job. Maybe you're just looking for something new in your life. Maybe your relationship seems like it's fallen apart, or it already has. Some of you are in the midst of that hardship, and today, I hope the message of Job provides you hope that there is more to your story. Some of you maybe aren't there. Maybe life is okay, but you're on the cusp of something. Maybe you're looking forward to something, or trying to make a decision, or trying to figure out where your life needs to go. I hope you know that whatever lies ahead, it's going to be okay because God is with you. And maybe some of you right now are saying, Matt, I'm kind of in that, beginning Job part, like where everything's going really well, and that is great. But I'll just remind you, it won't always be that way. But while it is, remember, you can be present with those who might need you most. But wherever you are, I'm going to invite you to do something today. We're going to end this series and this time with something special. Instead of me praying for you, I'm going to invite you to come forward and pray. In fact, I'm going to invite the musicians to come forward at the sites. Webster musicians can come forward. And as they start playing, here's what I'd like you to do. At the front of the sanctuary, we're going to just have a time of prayer. Now, you can come up and you can pray. You can kneel down on the floor. You can pray, or you can go to care ministers. There's going to be pastors and care ministers here to pray for you. Because sometimes when we're in the midst of something really hard, we just need to sometimes stop trying to speak and just listen to words being poured over us. In fact, at the very end of the book of Job, there's this one verse where it says that Job covered his mouth and he promised no longer to speak, but just to listen to God. So today, I invite you to come forward for a time of prayer. Wherever you are in your life, we all need sometimes to stop speaking and just to listen to what it is that God would say to us, what it is that God promises us, what it is that that God wants to speak into our lives. So today, as the music plays, as our time ends, I invite you to cover your mouth, to take a moment to stop speaking and instead to listen. I invite you to come forward and offer whatever it is that's weighing you down, whatever you're wrestling with, whatever you're struggling with. I invite you to offer it to God. And maybe even today, you'll hear God speaking to you out of the whirlwind. Please come forward and pray.